is no secret that I am a Warhammer fan, and linking this passion to Japan is not a difficult task, knowing how inspired by Japanese history were some elements of wargaming. Despite this inspiration, Warhammer has not been extremely popular in Japan until very recently, with the opening of more and more stores in populated areas such as Tokyo with Akihabara, Warhammer Cafe, or even in the near future in Yokosuka. This is due to many factors such as the gradual expansion of Games Workshop in general, but also the fact that Warhammer had quite a lot of concurrency in Japan, with modeling being quite implanted even before the arrival of the Nottingham brand. Moreover, this franchise is still extremely foreign to many Japanese. The translation convention in the country do not create many intercultural connections, and more often than not, Japanese translation of Warhammer are simply just gairaigo or English transcription in Japanese, creating a language barrier that maybe doesn't help creating more and more connection with culture, unlike French or Italian translations. Being a British brand, Games Workshop has a certain vision of Japan shaped by British economic history for the first part, but also general Western perception of the country. This episode is kind of special and not to be taken as seriously as the others, but I think it is a good opportunity to present a hobby I'm quite attached to, while keeping an important link with Japanese culture that I value on the same level. Often in fiction, especially non-Japanese one, the level of inspiration can be seen as quite shallow, not really taking Japanese philosophy in account, but simply commodifying its aesthetic. Another factor to take in account is the point of view. In many Western stories about Japan, there is a Western point of view, be it one of the characters or the language convention in the story. In any case, let us start this analysis of Japanese inspiration with probably the most obvious Japanese inspired element of Warhammer, namely the Tau Empire. Tau Empire is one of the most recent factions in the game. Well, recent, that was 20 years ago, but still in terms of Warhammer, this is quite recent. It came at a period where anime and manga in general were increasingly popular in the US, and perhaps Games Workshop also wanted to conquer the Japanese market at this time. Even though for story purposes at the beginning, the Tau Empire was seen as the Gary Stew of faction, it gained its own popularity, and nowadays it is a overwhelmingly respected faction among its peers, even though grognards are probably going to say the contrary. The Japanese inspiration is quite obvious on the aesthetic side for the different archetypes of Tau Empire units. We have the battle suits, who are fully inspired by mecha genre, and especially Gundam, even though no specific model corresponds to how Tau battlesuits are built, but still we can find elements of inspiration. The second archetype of Tau are its infantry, namely the Fire Warriors, who are fully inspired by samurai in their aesthetic. We can see on this image that, for example, elements of armor plates are quite similar. But the inspiration are not just shallowly aesthetic. The Taus are definitely foreign in this universe. They are not understood as human, not only because they are Xenos in the lore, but also for a spectator perspective. Even the Eldar faction are more humanly understood. The Toes are seen as a collectivist faction, which, for a Western perspective, is often how Asian society are perceived, especially in the Buddhist influence sphere. And speaking of Buddhism, this is probably what influenced the most the Tao philosophy, relying on harmony and acceptance, even though, like every other Warhammer faction, they have a quite dark side. The Buddhist inspiration can be also seen in the naming convention of Tao, who have very Sanskrit-like names, to say the least, completely fitting in this dharmic inspiration. Overall, it feels like Taos are the transcription of how Japanese were seen, especially before the Second World War, as an extremely different people with next to no shared values, and this perception of lack of individualism was also portrayed by politicians. For example, in France, Japanese people were called ants by one of the former prime minister, putting emphasis on how they lacked individuality. As if Tao Empire had a sort of hive mind, which is not far from the truth, knowing that its heroes have almost complete domination over their subjects. Still, most of this inspiration is purely aesthetical. Even though Japanese inspiration for Eldar are quite visible on the aesthetic side, the most important Japanese legacy we can find in this faction are not on appearance but on the lore, and especially a very specific point, namely the different path Eldar follow in their lives. The most well-known paths are of course the aspect warriors, who focus on one specific aspect of war, let it be infiltration, destruction, or even shock assault. Here the Japanese inspiration is more about the different masters that the country has known. This idea of people solely focusing on one task and mastering it fully. In modern Japan, this is a very present trope but also issue. We can find masters all over Japan in different arts, especially the most traditional one, let it be Kokeshi for example. Here a person dedicates their life to one aspect of Japanese art to become a master. But the problem is that nowadays it is more and more difficult to find continuation in the perpetuation of such arts, making it extremely worrying for Japanese art sphere to eventually lose an important knowledge. This mastery is not only found in aspect warriors but also the different paths such as Bone Singer or Farseers. But it is not contained to Warhammer 40,000. It can also be found in Warhammer Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy with the different High Elf faction who also have different paths to master. As I said earlier, Japanese inspiration can be also found in other games of Warhammer, and the oldest inspiration is from Warhammer Fantasy, especially the second edition with the infamous faction of Nippon. At this time, Japan was seen as an economic menace for the rest of Western world, and if the most extreme example of anti-Japanese sentiment can be found in the US, especially in the automobile industry. Britain was not spared by this fear of Japanese complete takeover, creating a quite negative sentiment toward Japanese, especially knowing that lots of veterans were still alive at this time, and the souvenir of Japan being a dangerous nation was quite present in civil society, and at this time in the English-Saxon world, anime and manga were not the most popular. Therefore, the perception of Japan was extremely cliché to say the least, and Nippon faction completely embodies this idea of cliché Japan. From the naming convention, such as naming most characters after car brands such as Toyota and Honda, but also towards the units and aesthetic, which was quite cliché, notably having kamikaze being a unit, whereas kamikaze are a very different phenomenon that was portrayed in the game, but also simply retaking samurai aesthetic to an extent that made them extremely similar to a yellow peril aesthetic. Overall, if this vision has been completely thrown away and Nippon never heard again since quite a long time, this is notably due to the evolution of the perception of Japan in the UK at this period, who went from an economic danger to a more suitable partner and market. Those changes can be found in how Japanese aesthetic was retaken by many factions in a way more positive way. I really wonder if Nippon will ever come back on the wargaming scene, as some older factions were recently brought back, such as Kate or the Space Dwarf. A blade short, this video was mostly an introduction to a topic I hope to learn more about with more experience. But the shortness of this video is only a symptom of Japanese aesthetic only being understood for its visual and not much for what is under the armor, for example. This level of shallowness shouldn't be understood as a misunderstanding of the culture, but more about a lack of need to understand the culture to portray it to a different public. Still, there is one example I find interesting that's not directly inspired by Japanese culture, but still embodies one of its aspects, and notably one that I researched on. In the Horus Heresy novels, we encounter the Fourth Legion, the Iron Warriors, and if aesthetically they are inspired by Greece and Persia, their psychology is quite akin to a certain mentality that was found in the Japanese land army, leading to not only extreme physical punishment, bullying and others, but also creating a mentality that devaluated life to an extent that, of course, allowed the creation of kamikaze corps in the air and navy. In the Horus Heresy series, this is a core idea of Iron Warriors, but for Japanese army this was not always the case, and before the death of Nogi and Togo, Japanese army tried its much to abide to international law, albeit only against Western opponents, not really the Chinese. But after their death, and especially due to the absence of philosophical legacy of their teachings, Japanese army started to completely discard international rights, with apogee found in the Second World War. This trauma led the Japanese current army, the self-defense forces, to shift completely and take the polar opposite of this doctrine, creating an army so law-abiding that even during emergency it could not be allowed to ignore traffic signals, for example. This is with this small anecdote that I will conclude this episode, hoping it has pleased you. I will try to make another video about this hobby in the future should I get more experience. In that case, hope to see you next time.